When you're working on a big project, chances are rendering is where the bottleneck is going to happen. In fact, sometimes even getting it to render at all is quite a feat. So here's a few tricks that we use to speed things up. First off is a no-brainer. If the camera doesn't see it, delete it. Our environment was pretty massive, but we set everything up with referenced models, so when you open the scene, it's just got stand-ins for everything. Then we wrote a script so you could just select the objects you need, hit a button, and it imports the full models. It also works the other way for offloading models, but it's way faster to start empty and build it all up. The next thing is that the biggest memory hog for a scene like this is the textures. I think there's something like 7 gigs of textures for the environment alone, so there's no way we can load that all into RAM. We actually had to beat this with 2 different things. First, we converted all of our textures into .map files. This is something that's specific to Mental Ray, but there's probably something similar in other renderers as well. What map files do is they put the image data into a format that the renderer can read directly from disk. It's not quite as fast because every time it needs something it has to access the hard drive, but the alternative is texture swapping, where it's loading and unloading entire image files into RAM, and that instantly kills a render. The other thing we had to do was split our environment into Z passes. Because we had city blocks with nice clear edges, we just did a separate pass for each block, and that cut the scene into manageable chunks so the renderer could chew through it. You can also do it with the clipping planes on the camera. Just set it to render 0 through 1000, then 1000 to 2000, and so on until you get images that you can stack on top of each other. The last big thing we did is to use 2D motion blur. You probably already know that you can do depth of field by just rendering a depth pass and using that to control a compound blur in the compositing stage. But you can also do something similar with motion vectors. The red and the green channels work like a clock to tell us which direction a pixel is moving, and the blue channel scales that value to tell us how fast it's moving. I used a plugin called SmoothKit, but I think there's something similar built into Nuke Fusion. You just plug these motion vectors into your blur node, tell it what channels are supposed to do what, and it will blur each pixel individually based on the direction it's traveling in. It's not quite as nice as true 3D blur, but it's fast and it works. Of course, the last thing you might consider, especially for a big project like this, is that Mental Ray makes some gorgeous pictures, but it's also pretty slow compared to a lot of the other renderers out there. The one that's most commonly used is Pixar's RenderMan. I just posted a much more in-depth discussion on RenderMan and a few other renderers on the blog. I haven't gotten a chance to use all those different renderers myself, though, so if you happen to have some insight into how those other packages work, feel free to chime in. And I also want to thank FXPhD for sponsoring this episode. The new July term is currently starting with a rerun of my Lighting and XSI course, and they've just announced their first ever RenderMan course. So if you've got a technical mind and want a chance to play around with RenderMan, it's going to be a really fun class.